Hey leaders, in this episode of Building a Culture of Collaboration, Kurtis and I are joined by Jeanne Spiller and Mark Onuscheck, two educational leaders, authors, and consultants and co-editors of a number of PLC at Work titles. In this episode, we're going to dig into how to build a highly intentional and focused culture of collaboration with a direct emphasis on how that culture can have a significant impact on literacy success for learners.
This episode is also part of the National Literacy Month with Reading is Fundamental campaign, a partnership between the B Podcast Network and Reading is Fundamental to host numerous productive conversations across our network of podcasts about developing kids' reading and literacy skills for life. So let's get started.
Intentional and purposeful focus on building a culture of collaboration is the secret for leaders striving to make a difference. In building a culture of collaboration, Kurtis and Lorna Hewson will share simple tips, ideas, and strategies to take your organization's collaborative efforts to the next level.
Welcome to another episode of Building a Culture of Collaboration. As always, I'm Lorna Hewson, co-founder and lead learner of Jigsaw Learning.
And I'm Kurtis Hewson. Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Jeanne Spiller and Mark Onuscheck. Great to have you here today, Jeanne and Mark.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
So I have a little bit of a bio that we'll read out for our listeners, but then I would love to turn back and have you fill in any of the blanks or something around your educational journey here. So Jeanne, I'll start with you. With over 34 years in K-12 education, Jeanne Spiller is a seasoned educational leader and consultant specializing in implementation of the professional learning communities, PLC process, curriculum development, instructional coaching, and professional development. She was a sixth grade English language arts and social studies teacher for 13 years, a middle school administrator, and served as an assistant superintendent for teaching and learning for 16 years. As a co-author of influential education books and an associate with Solution Tree, she is dedicated to fostering high-quality, equitable education and driving innovation in school districts. Mark is the Director of Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment at Stevenson High School. Prior to that, he has been an English teacher, Department Chair of English, and adjunct faculty member at DePaul University, where he taught courses in corporate social responsibility and in creativity. Mark has co-authored a number of books focused on the function of professional learning communities to support teacher learning and support student learning. So it's always fun getting to hear your bio read out in front of you, but I'd love, and Jeanne, why don't we start with you? Anything that you could share with our listeners as far as your background, your journey, and what's kind of
a little more personal than what we just read.
brought you to this place, not only as an educator, but as someone who now is really heavily involved in supporting educators.
Yeah, so I retired from that position as assistant soup in School District 96 about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now. And I moved from Illinois to Wisconsin. So I now live in the great state of Wisconsin, but don't worry, Mark, I'm not a Green Bay Packers fan. I'll still be a Bear. So I just want to make sure people hear that. But no, I'm enjoying really hopefully making a difference all across the country around implementation of professional learning communities, but also fostering that, as you mentioned, intentional, focused, collaborative culture that we know helps us help students succeed at high levels. So that's something that I'm pretty passionate about. Also passionate about really holding high expectations for all students, and not just saying that, but absolutely living that in all of the efforts that we put forward as educators.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeanne. And Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, I'd just echo all the things that Jeanne just said, especially in terms of building collaborative conversations within our nation, in and among, the United States and now Canada, of course. How exciting is that? I'm just so, I guess what I'd sort of share is I started my teaching career at Stevenson, where all these ideas around building collaborative teams was just getting started when I was a young English teacher. And it's all I ever know now. Like, it's all I've ever known as an educator is to be in collaborative conversations with other experts, and how much I've engaged in those conversations and how much I've learned from so many of my colleagues, Jeanne here too, right? And that how significant it is to support these conversations to meet the really significant challenges in education. My personal interest, of course, in my work has a lot to do with literacy. And when I was a young English teacher, I just became acutely aware that, knowledge is inextricably tied to language, like we think in language, and how we help to support students' capacities with language and their capacities to compose their thoughts and how they put words together and how words make meaning is so significant to me. So I've always been fascinated by this topic. I care about it quite a bit. And I have a lot of other interests too. I live in Chicago with my wife, who has a theater company. She's an actress there, and we have 2 kids who I've, read to as a father from the day they were born. We have pictures of me reading to them, and I still read to them. I just believe in really connecting with people through words and through stories, and how genuinely significant that is to, our relationships. So I think of it not just as a way to educate people, but as a way to bring people together. And that means a lot to me too.
Absolutely. I think about that connection. I did the same thing that we did the same thing of reading to our children when they were just babes and all the way through, and the kids recall and actually talk about the power of that. And our oldest daughter now is married and a couple years into her marriage, so she's thinking about having children, and it's one of the things that she talks about all the time is how powerful that sharing of story is, and that she is dedicated to doing that with her children as well, which is really super exciting. And we know that those connections that we make through literacy are so incredibly powerful.
So let's move on that idea of connection. So we talk about that passion for literacy and reading, but also that shared passion of building a culture of collaboration. Jeanne and Mark, I'd love for either one of you to jump in on what do you see as the connection between the two?
Yeah. Well, for me, it has so much to do with, learning together. So one thing that we're really aware of here at Stevenson, and the work that I know Jeanne and I both do with Solution Tree, is to connect people with, really research-based ideas and to collaborate around those research-based ideas. And that requires always having a really strong reference point for those ideas, and then sharing those ideas out in a way that's synthesized and substantiated through, developing perhaps, what we do a lot of is creating books, for people to read and better understand the work that we do. And I think bringing people together around that reading process and, the reflection that comes with engaging people in research or readings about how to become better at what we do, and this idea of continuous improvement, all factors into the purpose of good collaboration and how we're evolving to be better educators and better school cultures through these exchanges with each other's thoughts. And, oftentimes for us, a good reading, a good article gives people a launching point to connect around topics that are a little different from what we thought we would do, and helps us to engage in like how we would, bring that into our work with our students, or into sort of just the ideas and innovations that we're having as a team.
And I would just add to that, I agree wholeheartedly with what Mark said, but I kind of narrow it down to 2 things, collective clarity and collective wisdom. And I think that's what we're really after when we're talking about any subject, but literacy for sure. We need collective clarity around the standards, for example, because they're pretty nuanced. and they can be interpreted in lots of different ways. So that collective clarity around what do we actually mean when we say theme? What is that to you? What is that to you? And then the collective wisdom of the team, I think, brings that all together. So it's, that it's collective clarity, collective wisdom to me is the key connector between any subject, but literacy in particular is not as black and white as some of the other subjects can be.
Well, and we know that, let's just take reading, for example, it's a complex process that, again, the idea, I mean, we talk about it all the time in this podcast, the idea that the room is smarter than anyone in the room. And when we're trying to do something as complex as achieve literacy success for our students, we're going to be able to do that more effectively if it's through collaborative processes. And I love that idea of the collective clarity and wisdom.
Yeah. One thing that I think is interesting about our work, and Jeanne and I have talked about this before, is, when you're in a collaborative culture, it provides you with a way into radiating a new idea. And the important thing that I think is happening, at least in our school and in professional learning communities, is they take an idea and then the idea churns in teams, and the teams are really connecting with the idea and then trying to figure out how it's going to work best for their students or how it's going to work best for their subject area. And I think one thing that we found with this literacy work is that you really need to be thinking differently about supporting literacy in a science classroom than an English classroom. And reading fiction is so different from reading history. I mean, you know how the story ends in history, right? That alone. So I think the ideas that we've been really circulating around is, well, how do you build up these conversations in these subject areas that think, oh, reading and writing literacy strategies are for the English teacher to do, and that's their job. And my job is to teach science, or my job is to teach mathematics, or, whatever it might be. But that there's this real capacity building within each subject area to really connect as to what it means to think like a historian and read like a historian or write like a scientist. Things along those lines, I think allows for two things to come together, like chocolate and peanut butter. Our literacy coaches talking with our science teachers to bring those two things together in a way to better support, the student experience and really get students inspired to be engaged in the reading and thinking processes of science, and how literacy-based strategies can do that.
Mark, I'm really interested you talked when we first introduced of being a young English teacher at the school where a lot of the PLC work began, where a lot of those seeds were first planted by Rick Dufour and associates there. But I know through our experience, we've come into many, and I remember Rick writing about it at one point, many schools that go, oh yeah, we're a PLC. And you go, are you? Or we hear often, we collaborate all the time, but without a really firm idea of when we say collaborate, what does that mean? Or when we say we are a school engaging in PLC work, what does that mean? I'd love to turn that to the two of you of what do you see as what are the conditions that make true collaboration or true work in a professional learning community happening versus a school that doesn't have those conditions? What would you see as the main conditions that are essential for effective cultures of collaboration?
Sure. Do you want to start, Jeanne, or do you want me to dive in?
Go ahead, Mark. I'll jump in.
Yeah, for me, it goes beyond sharing. So the one difference that I notice a lot in schools is there are teams that will share what they're doing, and they're really open about it. There's like a lot of, spirit behind that. And I think that's great. Like, I think sharing is so important. We all value sharing. But I think the elements of collaboration elevate sharing to to the point where you're saying to yourselves, you know, how are we inquiring, and is there a collective inquiry into how well our work is progressing student learning? And we get really curious about that. We say to ourselves, let's collaborate over new ideas and innovate together and bounce ideas around and challenge one another. And that's beyond sharing. That's real collective inquiry. And then really test out ideas, like, you know, set a goal and say to ourselves, well, how might we reach this goal and achieve greater results? And how do we, really engage in sort of our own case studies of the work that we're doing? And how do we continue to collaborate through our analysis of, say, our assessments of student learning to constantly keep us in the present tense and respond to students in the present tense and feed off one another's thought processes in order to intervene and help students that might be struggling and help students, reach their fullest enriched potentials. So I think collaboration is best indicated by seeing those things happening in those team meetings where there's a lot of inquiry, there's a lot of questioning, there's a lot of, feeding off one another's ideas and building up off those ideas and then testing out those ideas and, just sort of allowing for that level of innovation to bring a lot of fresh air into the work that we do with students. And I think those are the best teams that I've ever been on. That said, teams go through a process, there's a continuum, and I never shy away from that. It's all easier said than done. And it takes a while for a team to come together to learn to collaborate at that level. And there are definitely days where it feels more like sharing, but sharing's important to get to collaboration. So I think I never say to, myself, that team is, going to be self-sustaining forever. Everyone will always need to continue to support and keep that challenge in front of ourselves to keep things fresh and to continuously improve.
I'd love to hear Jeanne's thoughts around this, but I do want to make a point of that idea of learning to collaborate and recognizing that it's not just a natural thing that happens. It takes intentionality and practice to be able to be comfortable challenging one another, asking questions, asking hard questions, and then being open to being challenged myself.
Well, and that level of just sharing, and like you said, it's a good thing to share with each other, but at the same point, that true collaboration involves a level of vulnerability too, that we need to be vulnerable with each other to talk deeply and collaborate deeply on our practice and how we're impacting students too.
So Jeanne, I hope we didn't steal some of the thunder that you were coming with next here.
I'm not even sure where to start because you said so many things I wanted to comment. But I will say that I think teams always have really good intentions of collaborating in a meaningful way. But I think what gets in the way sometimes is they're not sure what they should be focused on. So I know we teach that a lot of the focus of teams, maybe not all of it, should be on the 4 critical questions of a professional learning community. Really, what is it we want students to learn? Digging deeply into that. And like I said, the standards can be very nuanced. So what are we looking for within each one of those essential standards that we might have outlined as something we want to ensure students know? So that can take a lot of a team's time to get clear on that. And then, how are we going to know? So those assessments that were, whether they're quick check-in points or they're more formalized, maybe more in-depth assessments. And then what are we going to do, if students don't learn? And then 4, what about kids who come in and need something a little bit more, maybe some extension or even acceleration? So if teams can keep the focus on those questions, most of the time, I think they're going to have those types of conversations that you heard Mark talking about, those conversations that challenge each other to think a little bit differently. That's, again, where the collective wisdom of the team comes in. But teams have to get past or beyond what is comfortable. I think there's just things that people tend to go to because they're comfortable. It's comfortable talking about instruction, but it's not as comfortable putting data in front of each other. That vulnerability you were talking about, that's a little bit uncomfortable. So we really need brave educators who are willing to say, you know what, my data maybe doesn't look as good as yours. What can I learn from you? How can we all learn from this? That's the type of collaboration that we always wanted to see in our district. It's hard to get there. It's really hard to get there. And there has to be some, like you said, learning. And let's try this. I think there's this myth out there that we have to build trust before we can put data in front of each other. But in reality, putting data in front of each other and seeing that nothing bad happens when we do that builds trust.
Yes.
Right. So I think that's really what I think I'm still working on with a lot of school districts across the country is let's really get people to be more comfortable being uncomfortable sometimes, to get past that. So I just kept thinking about that when you guys were talking, and I think that is really part of where we need to go. And I think PLC light happens because people stay in the comfortable for way too long.
Yeah, great.
PLC light sometimes it happens when, you know, people want like perfect gets in the way of good, right? And everyone wants like a very steady answer that's like, oh, that's the perfect answer. Where I think when you're dealing with complex problems and challenges in education, you're just gonna have to roll up your sleeves and, you know, do what the very first book says, like learn by doing, and just getting like underneath the hood of the car and tinker around and realize that, you know, there's no one size fits all answer to some educational questions, and that collaboration has a lot to do with, hey, this worked for 60% of my students, but what about these other 40%? And how do we come up with an answer for 10% of those students and the other 10% and the other 10%? And I think one thing that I've always valued in challenging teaming conversations that were highly collaborative is there were days when I was absolutely opposed to my colleague. I was like, there is no way I'm going to do that. That's not my style. That doesn't work for me as a teacher. And then over like a couple of years, I started to realize, I'm like, it's not about my teaching style or like what's comfortable for me. And I would like borrow someone's outrageous idea that I thought never would work. And it worked for like the 10, 15% of the students that I really struggled to like connect with. And I think when we think like that, it helps because it helps to substantiate, you know, the value of your own ideas, but the added value of multiple perspectives and multiple viewpoints, and how when you're working with students, they might need the strategies that another teacher might be using and really be thinking about, and you just deploy them, and you're reaching all students, and suddenly my students are everyone's students and everyone else's students are my students too, and that we're really engaged in this idea of all working together to support students and really reach into other people's experiences to help.
That learn by doing has always resonated for us. We often, when working with schools and school or system leaders, reference the adage of ready, fire, aim. And it doesn't mean just fire.
Right.
Randomly.
There's
You ready?
intention.
There's intentionality. We prepare. We, as you've mentioned, we make sure there's some research based to what it is that we're trying, but then you fire. And then you can aim, you can tweak, adjust as you go, which I think is so important for us.
Well, and Mark, what you were saying about being able to take ideas from others, really, this is the essence of creating a collaborative culture, that we can talk about an issue or a concern that we have around a student, and we access those multiple ideas around the table, even knowing that, like you said, It might not have been what I preferred to use, but yet it could be a strategy that would work for a particular student. And it might be a strategy that is highly successful in my partner's classroom, but I have never actually accessed it. And we need to be able to create that teaming and open collaboration in order to access all of those ideas.
Yeah.
I'm
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Mark.
Just one other small thing that I just sort of mentioned is, collaboration also gives you jet fuel. Like, I think there's like the technical aspects of collaboration and the continuous improvement piece. But as an educator, if you've been at it for 15 years, 20 years, you can get tired. Like you can if you're alone, working in isolation and feeling like it's all on you. And you get I think a lot of educators run out of some steam every once in a while, or they have those dips and they're like discouraged. But being on a team and collaborating, it really does give you jet fuel. And I think that's an important thing to remember too, is the exciting thing about where I work is there's just so much jet fuel. Like the teachers come in and it's jet fuel, jet fuel, jet fuel. And there's just an energy that's sort of in a culture like that that's really exciting for me. And I think educators really deserve to have those experiences and be in those environments, and students deserve that too. They deserve to have schools with a lot of jet fuel.
It's interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jeannie.
I just want to add to that because, well, first of all, Mark, you're making me miss being around all the jet fuel.
Come on back right now. Come on back.
Yeah.
Anytime.
I got a job opening, Jeannie. You're it.
Well, no, and I was thinking the whole time we were having this conversation about, how in a professional learning community, the L in learning is not just about students, it's about all of us. And the collaborative process is that opportunity for us to learn together so that our students benefit. And I don't know if we always make that connection for people. I think the L seems to be, and it is about student learning as well. But I think when we learn more, they learn more. And so I was just thinking about that and how, it can be as simple as a team putting their heads together and saying, we've been struggling with main idea with students. So let's go out and research some best practices and then come back to the table and have that conversation instead of saying, we have to wait till we get some more training on that. That L is so powerful when teams collaborate around learning so that, again, their students can be the ones who benefit most from that learning. So I just wanted to add that.
We're nodding. You're talking our language. We often share it within our work that it really comes back to the statement of every child deserves a team. And that's critically important in our mind. So Jeannie, I'm curious, from your previous system leader role and then the work you do now with system leaders, I've heard this before and I've actually lived in this space personally. What advice would you give to an educational leader who may feel they don't have the literacy expertise to lead collaborative work that's focused on improved reading and writing outcomes for students? I see this all the time where, especially if someone potentially has maybe come from a high school setting down to elementary, doesn't have some of the same understanding of learning to read and feel uncomfortable trying to lead that collaborative work. What would you say? What advice would you give them? How could they get started?
First of all, I'll start by saying I don't think you have to be a literacy expert to lead the collaborative process. However, with that said, I also think it's important to stay on top of what's happening in literacy or any subject area as a leader, to just understand kind of what's going on in the world. In the world of literacy, there's always something happening, some disagreement between different sides of the coin, so to speak. But stay on top of that. But as a leader, I don't think in fostering the collaborative process that you have to be a literacy expert. What you should be watching for are the things we talked about already. Is the team focused on learning? Are they truly having conversations that are leading them to look at evidence and then make decisions based on that evidence? Are they living that cycle of inquiry that starts with what's essential for kids to know, and then team conversations around, are kids learning those things? What are we doing about it if they're not? All of that is what I would be looking for as a leader. I don't have to know literacy well to be able to do that. I do, again, I still need to stay on top of what's happening in the literacy world. At the same time, though, I think that's an important piece.
Mark, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think for the work of middle school and high school teachers, so this is, learning to read and then reading to learn, that whole divide is a really significant thing to own. And I think there's this misunderstanding sometimes that, because the student can, read words out loud, that they're actually comprehending them and literally processing them or making higher order inferencing skills happen on their own. And that we really need to dedicate ourselves as students are continuing to develop in their education and continuing to confront more complex texts over time, that we're committing ourselves to helping them strategically to build that capacity and that cognitive function inside of their minds, so that they're able to, learn from what they've read on their own and process. And I think that piece is difficult for teachers. Like, I think having that conversation sometimes is new to a lot of teachers, or taking on that responsibility seems like, oh, well, why would I do that? They know how to read, but whenever they come to class, they look at me like they didn't understand a single thing that they read. Well, that helps us to navigate that conversation a bit and bring that capacity to the instructional process in a social studies class, in a science class, in a math class, in a fine arts class, and help the teacher to create sort of some really meaningful experiences, that help the student learn to process, in a way, like I said earlier, that gets students to think like a mathematician would think, to read like a mathematician, to like read like a scientist, to write like a scientist, to write like a researcher. Things like that are significant. And I think sometimes sometimes teachers are so focused on their content and the skills of their subject area that they're forgetting that to get students to really access those things at higher levels, there is that commitment to the literacy approach. And those conversations have been super exciting here at Stevenson when our literacy coaches are meeting with all different subject areas. There are a lot of aha moments, like, oh, like that's what that will do, or that makes so much more sense now to help my student with that particular standard. So we've done a lot of work with collaborating on crosswalking the literacy-based strategies in our books to, standards in social studies or standards in science, and trying to help teachers match a relationship between literacy-based strategies and collaborate around why that strategy would work best for this task you're asking students to achieve. And that's been really compelling for us. I think there's a lot of, insights that start to emerge when experts in their field meet with experts in literacy, like bring those two things together. Again, the chocolate and peanut butter thing,
Well, and I think this goes then to what Jeanne was saying of, as a leader, I don't need to be the literacy expert, but I certainly want to create the conditions or the structures and processes where, as you mentioned, Mark, the chocolate and the peanut butter are coming together. That does become my responsibility.
Yep.
Yeah. And I would just add to that too. I would be, as a leader, really listening and responding like a coach. Because what I would want to do is push thinking and get people to go maybe a little bit deeper. I would also be listening for alibis. Like, are they owning this work, or are they alibying it or passing the buck, so to speak? If the kids would only be more interested in this, well, then I would say, well, okay, how do you as a team create more interest in your instruction. Those kinds of things is what I would be listening for. Also a culture of high beliefs, fostering that as a leader. Belief in kids. I mean, being able to kind of stop somebody in their tracks if they're starting to talk about a kid not being able to do something. And, you know, even asking questions like, what if we believe they could, what might we do differently? You know, those kinds of conversations I think are more important. I would leave the literacy expertise really up to the team, but know enough about it to be able to correct something that might be going down the wrong path.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we have so many levels of expertise in each of our buildings. And when you think of subject area specialists, they certainly have their own set of skills and set of academic ventures for moving forward. And I think often one of the things that pops into my head as we've been talking about this is that idea of status quo, that we can't be comfortable with remaining status quo, that my expertise in my classroom is enough. That's all I need. I don't need to be able to reach out to my colleagues because I've got what I need. So I'd love for you to be able to comment on how do we engage collaboration to fight against that idea of status quo?
Oh, I think that's such a great question. I'm gonna just jump right in because I am, you know, but in my job, I have to be very evidence-based, like and data-driven and work in a data-driven culture. And I think people are just so unaware of like the statistics, just using literacy as an example, of, you know, how people are growing up and how they mature into adults, and just statistically where their reading level lies as an adult, you know. And I think it's really important to confront the statistics that we see in schools and address that status quo question with some genuine data that's sometimes shocking, you know. And I think whenever I'm working with schools, I'll do a data story about, like, you know, what does the data look like for a first grader? What does it look like for a fifth grader, an eighth grader, a high school student? And what's happening in that school? Like, what's the data story tell you? And really working from a place of really good information to say, we don't want this. Things have to change. I mean, we can't be satisfied with, you know, 50% of our population in the United States reading at or below a sixth grade reading level. I'm just throwing that out there. You know, I'm kind of making that statistic up. Maybe it's accurate. It's close to accurate. I think, actually, I do
Close,
think
for sure. Yeah.
But, you know, or if we're graduating our seniors at an eighth grade reading level, well, that, you know, we're saying that they're earning a high school diploma with an eighth grade reading. That doesn't work, you know, like that's not a graduating senior. And I think that confronts the status quo. It says we have to get better. Like, I think there has to be a bold, and Jeanne used the word brave, conversation. And I think it has to be brave. I think we have to confront this. And it really does have a lifelong effect on people. And I think if we stay with the status quo, it inhibits students to grow up to their incredible potentials. It shuts doors on students into their futures instead of keeping doors open to them.
I want to just reference, before we hear from Jeanne, the idea of it's really hard to have that conversation without data. And we saw the same thing in our school. When we could, without the data, it's, yeah, we're doing pretty good. Our kids seem to be doing well. Everyone seems to be happy. But then when we could surface, actually the data shows 55% of our students are reading below their grade level. Well, first it started a question of, well, that test, there must be something wrong. Are we using the right tool, the right test, before we could get to the, so what do we do? What's our next step?
What's our response?
The data is so critically important for that, to help
Well,
inform and drive that conversation.
It gives the impetus for change.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's why
Yeah.
question number 2 is so important, is it keeps
Yeah.
that formative data in front of teachers all the time and collaborating, you know, again, in the present tense about their students to grow. Sorry, Jeannie, if I cut you off.
No, that's okay. I was thinking about the fact that when we don't have data in front of us, it's really easy to stay in the status quo.
Sure.
Kind of likening it to, like, if you don't ever get on the scale, you kind of just keep doing what you've always done, right? Until you kind of have to face that brutal reality. But what I've found interestingly is that sometimes that doesn't even compel people to do to really have a sense of urgency. It's kind of like, well, that's kind of what it is. And so I feel like really fostering the ability of leaders, and I'm talking about team leaders, teacher leaders, part of your guiding coalition, to really be the ones who daily at their team meetings are bringing those conversations to the table, that it isn't just formal leadership that's doing that. I think there has to be conversations that are ongoing around, are we okay with this? Right? When it's a colleague to colleague conversation, I think that is a little bit different than the administrator sitting in the room saying, hey, I'm not comfortable with this. How come you guys are? You know, so I think it's that we have to build that capacity of our educators to start asking each other those types of questions as well. So I think it's a combination of formal and informal leaders doing that. But I do think there has to be that piece that we consider. How are we fostering the ability for teams to have those conversations all the time, as opposed to just at a staff meeting, you know, when I present information as a principal. So yeah, that's important.
Awesome. Okay, well, we are reaching that point that we always get to in our podcast, where we ask each of our guests a very similar question. So here goes. In the spirit of, if you knew then what you know now, what advice would you give your past self in relation to establishing and sustaining highly impactful collaborative practices to impact literacy?
Go ahead, Mark.
No, you.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Oh, did you say you wanted me to go? I'm sorry. I apologize. Well, gosh, there's so many things that I would probably do differently. But I think one of them is really helping teams become much more intentional and focused in their work on a daily basis. I think when I first started leading this work, or even participating in it as a member of a team, I think I thought it was going to be more natural for people than it actually really is. So I think there would be a lot more intentional focus on how to collaborate effectively.
Yeah.
To me, I think that's where we kind of miss the mark. We kind of believe that people will naturally do that. And then I would also say, really, it's a silly kind of little thing. It's actually not silly at all, but it is a little thing. And that is really those norms that drive the way the team works together. I think when we first started to do the work in our school system, we kind of were like, every team should create norms, but we didn't give the why behind that. We didn't help them understand. So like I would be, and I say this all the time, I would be very purposefully redundant about why all the time. Meaning like to the point where people could pretty much finish my sentence because they know that I'm going to do the why every single time. But I think we didn't communicate the why around norms. So people were kind of like, okay, we created norms and then put them away somewhere and checked it off their list. They complied. But I think norms really can be so powerful in helping us all work in an environment that's effectively focused on learning. You know, but if we have the norms but we don't use them, then that really is, I say don't even create them if you're not going to use them.
Yeah.
You know, so that's just an example, but I think being very purposeful about why, being very intentional about what the work looks like, giving people models, helping people, supporting them, taking teams by the hand, and then gradually releasing away from them. Those are the things I think that I would do a little bit differently. I started to do a lot of that maybe more toward the end of my career, but didn't realize the value of it initially.
Jeannie, I'm smiling
We
here,
both
and
are.
before we go to Mark, I just want to share a little story that relates to this. I admit now that when first starting this work in the school, I didn't think we needed norms. I had read from Richard Dufour, you should have norms, and I thought, well, that must either be for a school where people don't know
They
each
don't
other
like
real
each other,
real
they
well,
won't
or
get along.
they must not
Yeah.
like people in his school, because in our school, we all get
We're
along
good.
so well. We're good. We don't need norms. And then found out, oh my goodness, we didn't
need
need
it.
norms when we were sharing and in comfortable spaces. But when we got into uncomfortable, we needed
yeah.
norms. And then we
Oh,
needed
yeah.
to talk about what did the norms mean and what do they look like.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. They can be a really powerful tool if you use them well.
Mhm.
Yeah, but again,
Absolutely.
in that same place of, I don't know
Yeah.
what Dufour's talking about. That must be a really rough school. He's
And Jeannie, we're smiling too, because there's so many things that you just talked about that part of our work is helping along with those structures and processes
Yeah.
for
Mhm.
collaborative teams, so that they do have how do we create this culture that we do this work in? And
Yes,
so,
exactly.
yeah, that's really exciting.
And so for Mark, what advice would you give your past self?
I'll say, keep pretty concise. Like, I think it's really important to celebrate in the collaborative work that we do. And I think celebration can show up in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be, donuts at a team meeting. It can be laughter, and really the joy of strong collegial relationships, and, making the work like truly curious and fun, and not get too, I mean, it's important to be serious. Believe me, I'm a serious man with a serious way, but it's really important to enjoy that collegiality and celebrate the gains and motivate the gain of perspectives and bringing people together. And I think we didn't realize that as much as we should realize sometimes. And I know when I was a young teacher, it was just work, and be diligent and serious. And I think it's really important to have a healthy dose of celebration in school cultures. And I think sometimes we forget that, or time goes by too quickly, and the year's up and everyone's left and we forgot to celebrate. It's like a good thing to do.
Awesome. Well, we have really appreciated this
Oh, it's been so
conversation
great.
and the sharing and knowledge that you've been able to share. If our listeners wanted to get a hold of you or to be able to connect, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you? Let's start Jeannie and then Mark.
So are you thinking via email or
Yeah,
sharing your email?
if they wanted to continue this conversation with Jeannie?
Yeah, feel
Best way
free
to
to
get a hold of you.
email me. I would love to hear from you. It's Jeanne Spiller 33 at gmail.com. So yeah, I
Excellent.
would love to continue the conversation for sure.
Awesome. We'll make sure that's in the show notes as well. And for you,
Okay.
Mark?
Same holds true. Email is best, and I'll always get in touch with a teacher that's ever emailed me, and it happens quite a bit, and I'm glad to do it. My email is M and then my last name, my laborious last name, Onuscheck. So think bonus check, but with an M instead of a B, at gmail.com.
Well, that was, I never
Remember.
thought about that.
That's
Okay.
awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, knowledge that you've shared, and for being part of our Building a Culture of Collaboration podcast. Thank you so much, Jeannie and Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Both of
Thank
you.
you for your listeners. Yep. Be well.
Well, I don't even know where to start by summarizing some of the ideas that we just chatted through with Jeannie and Mark. That was a wonderful conversation, and I don't even know where to begin to draw the parallels between what they do in their work and what we do in ours.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to that, building that culture of collaboration, there's a few things to reinforce that we heard.
Mhm.
I loved what Jeannie said around trying to create collective clarity and
Yeah.
collective wisdom. I think that
Yeah.
clarity and wisdom are important, but doing that collectively, she was really intentional in the wording there, and that stuck with me for sure.
Yeah, and Mark was talking about that culture of collaboration that allows us to radiate new ideas.
Mhm.
And I love that because when we think about our collaborative team meetings and how we build our process around key issues, the whole point of that
Mhm.
is that we get that opportunity to radiate new ideas through conversations like beginning with what if or how could we, and just moving that and growing those ideas.
You know, when it comes to that idea of literacy across across the curriculum, or you know, we often hear that, and I love Mark's reference to the middle school, high school of you're making that shift from learning to read to
Yeah.
reading to learn. But I really like the way that he framed it. And I'm going to take it with me. The idea that in a science class, I still want to be asking the question of how do I ensure my students can read like a scientist? How do I ensure that my students can write like a scientist? In my social
Making
studies, how
those
can
connections.
they read like a historian, write
Yeah.
like a historian? Because we know in each one of those subject disciplines, reading and writing is still important in relation to that discipline. But I've never heard it framed in that way, and I really liked that idea. I also I like the difference of him sharing that PLC
Yeah.
light idea of, are we in a culture that is comfortable sharing,
Sharing.
or are we in
Yeah.
a culture comfortable engaging in inquiry? And
Yeah.
those are two different things. And we're
Very
not saying
different.
sharing's not useful or worthwhile. Of course it is, but we get to a deeper place when we're truly collaborating for inquiry and questioning and challenging one another.
Mhm. And then moving into that, in order to get that clarity, we need to always be coming back to the why.
Mhm.
Why are we engaging the way that we are? Why are we focusing on the topics and areas that
Yeah.
we're focusing on?
But how many guests have we talked to that have continued to reinforce the idea that we have to learn how to collaborate?
Yeah.
And as leaders, how are we establishing those conditions
Yeah.
to be able to collaborate? Do we have structures and processes that are put in place for that to happen? And Jeannie, reflecting on past self of just thinking people would naturally know how to do that. And no,
Yeah.
it's not the case when we think about our organization.
Yeah, and beyond that, the driver is us being able to look at that data. And we had quite a few different comments there about how we can look at our data in order to help us recognize what the reality is, and then should give us the driver for now we need to address this. How do we do that collectively?
So we will include Jeannie and Mark's contact information within the show notes, but we have a number of resources that connect to today's conversation that we'll make sure that's in there. Two that we want to really focus in on is we have a development of a team norms guide, a leader's guide to team norms. That can be found at bit.ly. So it's bit.ly/team norms guide. So you can follow that link to get that free guide for leaders. And then we also have a on-demand workshop that really looks at how do we create focus for collaboration without feeling the need as a leader to micromanage. That we're not micromanaging, but we're setting the conditions that both Mark and Jeannie referred to. So you can learn more about that workshop at bit.ly. So that's bit.ly/collab focus. So that's COLLABFOCUS. And as always, love for you to like, subscribe, share the podcast with a colleague, with friends, and we really look forward to our next conversation, focus on building a culture of collaboration. You'll also see in the show notes a code to be able to get a discount 10% off on our book Collaborative Response. So with that, we wish you all the best and take care as you continue to build your cultures of collaboration.
See you soon.
Jigsaw Learning, founded by Kurtis and Lorna Hewson, is a team of educators who work with schools, districts, and educational leaders to establish collaborative response to ensure success for all students. Because every child deserves a team.